Idaho Territory, 1879, and the first snow had already dusted the high peaks above Cutbank Creek by the time the stage set Delphine Ashcroft down at the Crossroads store, 3 weeks earlier than the season generally allowed for such foolishness. Though nobody in that country had ever accused a mail-order bride's timing of making much sense, she stood in the yard with one trunk and a letter of introduction and watched the stage pull away, and she did not cry, because she had done all her crying on the coach from Missoula and had none left to spend on a crossroads. "You'll be Miss Ashcroft, then?" The storekeeper, a broad woman named Hetty Marsh, came out wiping her hands on her apron. "Elias Bramwell's bride. He sent word he'd be a day late fetching you on account of a bridge out past the Forks, and told me to see you fed and warm till he came." "Yes, Delphine," she managed the words steadily enough. "I confess I had not expected to be received quite so kindly, Mrs. Marsh. I have had rather a different sort of send-off." "Well, you're a good ways from wherever that was now." Hetty studied her a moment, travel-worn, thin through the face in a way that spoke of more than just 3 weeks on coaches, her chin held at an angle that looked practiced rather than natural. "Come in out of the wind, honey. Whatever you're carrying, it'll keep till you've had some coffee." She told the whole of it that evening, sitting at Hetty Marsh's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from, because Hetty Marsh had the particular gift of asking one gentle question and then simply waiting, and Delphine found, after 3 weeks of carrying it alone, that she could not hold it in any longer. "My father is a dry goods merchant in Springfield, Illinois, and I am the second of 4 daughters, and I have spent 26 years being told, in one fashion or another, that I was the daughter who did not turn out as expected." Delphine kept her voice level through long practice. "My elder sister Marguerite is beautiful and has always been told so. I am plain, and I have opinions I have never learned to keep to myself, and I turned down 2 respectable offers of marriage in my 20s because I did not care for either gentleman, and my father took that refusal considerably harder than I ever anticipated he would. 6 weeks ago, at supper, Marguerite found an advertisement in a newspaper, a rancher in Idaho Territory seeking a wife by correspondence. No particular requirements stated beyond a willingness to work, and she read it aloud to the table as a joke. She said, and I am quoting her precisely, that it was the only sort of husband left who might take me, since no sensible man in Springfield ever would. Everyone laughed. My father laughed loudest, and then he said, in the same breezy voice, that perhaps I ought to answer it, since I had proven myself unable to secure anything better closer to home. I believe he intended it as cruelty dressed up as a joke, the way Marguerite had. I do not believe either of them expected me to actually write the letter, but you did. I wrote it that same night, before my temper cooled enough to talk myself out of it, and I posted it myself the next morning, before anyone in the house woke. Delphine's hands tightened around the cup. Mr. Bramwell's reply came 3 weeks later. Plain, honest, no false promises, simply an account of his land and his situation, and a request to know more of me in return. We corresponded for a month, and when I told my father I meant to accept, he said, her voice caught, just slightly, the only crack in 3 weeks of composure. He said I needn't trouble to write once I arrived, that the family would manage its grief at losing me considerably faster than I imagined, and that I ought not to bother coming back, since there would be nothing here to come back to. And your sister? Marguerite packed my trunk for me, since I would not let her near it in any other spirit, and I found, when I unpacked in Missoula, that she had tucked a blue ribbon in among my things, with a note pinned to it. It said, "So you're not entirely ugly for him." I have thought a great deal, these 3 weeks, about whether to burn it. Delphine drew the ribbon from her sleeve where she had kept it, worn soft with handling. I have not managed to yet. Elias Bramwell came for her the next morning, a day behind schedule and apologizing for it before he'd properly climbed down from the wagon seat, and Delphine's first clear thought, watching him cross Hetty Marsh's yard, was that he did not look at all like a man desperate enough to advertise for a stranger's hand. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulder, weathered the particular deep brown of a man who spent every season outdoors, and he had a quiet, unhurried way of moving that reminded her, oddly, of the way careful men handled things they did not want to break. Miss Ashcroft. He removed his hat, which struck her as old-fashioned and rather touching in a country that seemed to have shed most of its formalities somewhere on the trail west. I'm sorry for the delay. The Elkhorn Bridge went out in the last storm, and I had to bring you round the long way. It is no trouble, Mr. Bramwell. I confess I have had rather more urgent things on my mind than a day's delay. Something in her voice must have carried more than she intended, because he studied her a moment with an attentiveness she was not accustomed to receiving from anyone, let alone a stranger. You look tired past what 3 weeks of coach travel accounts for, if you don't mind my saying so. I don't mind. I am tired past what the traveling accounts for, Mr. Bramwell, and I find I would rather tell you the whole truth of why before we go 1 mile further, because I would rather you turn this wagon around now than discover it later and feel you'd been misled. She told him the whole of it, standing in Hetty Marsh's yard, the same account she had given the night before, and she watched his face throughout with the particular braced attention of a woman waiting for the moment his expression would shift into something unkind. It did not come. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, without his jaw tightening the way she'd half expected, without any of the small tells she had learned to watch for in her father's face when her father was preparing to say something cutting. When she finished with her father's parting words, with the ribbon and its note, Elias Bramwell was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands. Your family sent you 1,100 miles west as a joke, he said finally, and told you not to bother coming home. Yes, and you came anyway. Not because you had nowhere else, but because you'd already decided you'd rather chance a stranger's cruelty than stay and endure your own family's. I don't know that I'd put it so plainly, Mr. Bramwell, but I don't believe you're wrong. He was quiet another moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone low and entirely without artifice. I had a sister once, younger than me, considerably kinder than most people had any right to expect, given how our own father treated her. She married young, to get free of the house, and married badly, and I was 3 states away building this claim when it happened, and I did not learn until it was long past mending. He looked at Delphine directly. I am not going to laugh at what your family did to you, Miss Ashcroft. I have got no laughter left in me for that particular cruelty. I'd take it as an honor if you'd still consider coming home with me, though I'd understand entirely if 3 weeks of being made a joke has left you wanting considerably gentler proof than my own word before you trust it. She married him within the week, in the small church at the crossroads, with Hetty Marsh and her husband standing witness, and the valley that gathered to watch, curious, as valleys always were, about a mail-order match, found itself, by the end of the ceremony, considerably more interested in the way Elias Bramwell looked at his new wife than in any gossip about how she'd come to be there. He's never looked at anybody like that in the 9 years I've known him, Hetty Marsh told her own husband on the ride home. Not once. I begin to think that family back in Illinois did her the strangest kindness of her whole life, without meaning to. The winter that followed was, Delphine would say, for the rest of her life, the finest season she had ever lived. Not because it was easy, because a Rocky Mountain winter at 7,000 feet was never easy, but because it was the first stretch of her adult life in which nobody's opinion of her carried any weight beyond her own and her husband's. Elias taught her to shoot, patiently, without once making her feel foolish for missing. She taught him, in turn, to read more than his letters had suggested he'd had occasion to practice. Sitting by the fire in the evenings with a battered volume of poetry she'd brought from Springfield, and she found, watching him work through a stanza with the same careful attention he gave everything, that she had never once in 26 years felt as thoroughly seen as she did in that small cabin. He kept the blue ribbon without her quite deciding to let him. She had left it on the mantel one evening, meaning to finally burn it, and had gone to bed without doing so, and had found it the next morning tucked instead into the frame of the small mirror by the washstand. And when she asked him about it, he said only, "Seemed a shame to let your sister's cruelty be the last word on it. Thought it might do better service, reminding you what you look like to somebody who isn't trying to wound you with the observation." There was a night in February, deep in the hardest stretch of that winter, when a fever took hold of Elias so fast and so hard that Delphine sat up with him 3 nights running, packing snow against his skin and forcing broth between his teeth, terrified in a way she had not let herself be since arriving in that country. He came through it on the 4th morning, weak and grey but himself again, and the first thing he said, finding her asleep sitting upright in the chair beside the bed, was her name. Not a request for water or an account of how he felt, simply her name, as though he had wanted to be certain, waking, that she was still the first thing in the room. "You could have left me to Hetty Marsh's care and gone back to Springfield the moment the roads cleared," he told her later, once he'd mended enough to sit up properly. Nobody would have thought less of a bride who found her first winter out here more than she'd bargained for. "I did not marry a bargain, Elias, I married you." She had not cried through any of the 3 nights of nursing him, and found, saying it, that she very nearly did now. "I have spent 26 years being told I was a poor bargain myself, by people who never once troubled to actually look at what they were bargaining for. I am not going to become the same kind of careless account keeper toward you." Before the trouble came up that mountain road, and it came, the way trouble always finds its way to a valley just when the worst of the winter seems finally behind it. There were these last weeks of a marriage settling into something neither of them had quite dared name yet. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a while longer, because what happens next is the test that decides whether it was ever real. And if a story about a woman who finally stopped being anybody's joke speaks to you, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. The trouble came in April, with the mud season, in the person of Delphine's own father. Franklin Ashcroft arrived at the Crossroads store, on a coach considerably finer than the one Delphine had travelled west on. And he came, Hetty Marsh reported with some alarm, asking directions to the Bramwell claim in a voice that suggested he expected to be received as a man doing his daughter a favour by the mere fact of his arrival. "I have come," he announced, standing in Elias Bramwell's own dooryard with his hat still on, "to discuss a matter of some urgency, and I trust my daughter will receive her own father with more grace than the circumstances of our last parting might suggest is owed." "You may say what you've come to say, father," Delphine said, "though I'd remind you that you told me not to bother coming home, which I have taken rather seriously, and I confess I'm curious what has changed your mind about the value of my company. Your Aunt Cornelia has died, and left a considerable sum in trust, $11,000, contingent upon your marriage to a man of, I quote the document precisely, good standing and settled prospects. Her solicitor has raised a question about whether a mountain claim in the territories qualifies as settled prospects in the legal sense the will intends, and I have come to discuss how we might best resolve that question in a manner that secures the inheritance for the family." Delphine stood very still in her own dooryard. "For the family," she repeated slowly. "Not for me." "Don't be tiresome, Delphine. Of course it benefits you as well. Say the rest of it, father. I have grown considerably less patient with half-finished sentences since I left Springfield." Her voice had gone flat in a way Elias, watching from the porch, had not yet heard from her. "What resolution have you in mind?" Franklin Ashcroft had the grace, at least, to look faintly uncomfortable. The solicitor has suggested that if the marriage were dissolved and a new match made, to a gentleman of more conventional standing, of which I have already identified a suitable candidate in Springfield, a widower with a respectable business, the trust's conditions would be unambiguously satisfied, and the funds could be secured for the family's benefit within the year. I have come to discuss the particulars. Hetty Marsh, who had driven Franklin Ashcroft out from the crossroads herself, and had stayed to see the visit through out of what she later admitted was pure unashamed nosiness, stood by the wagon with her arms crossed, watching the whole exchange with an expression that had curdled considerably since the morning. "I have known this family 3 years, Mr. Ashcroft," she said, before Elias could speak, "and I have watched your daughter build a life out here with her own 2 hands, in weather that would have sent a good many finer-bred women running back to wherever they came from. I confess I find it a remarkable thing, the timing of a father's sudden concern for her welfare arriving exactly alongside a lawyer's letter about money. This is a family matter, madam, and none of your concern. It became my concern the moment you drove into my yard asking directions, Mr. Ashcroft, and I find I have earned the right to an opinion about it." Hetty did not budge. "I have got a fair notion what folks call a man who only remembers his daughter exists when there's a dollar figure attached to the remembering." Elias Bramwell came down off the porch and stood beside his wife, and he did not raise his voice at all when he spoke, which somehow made the words land considerably harder than shouting would have. "You have come 1,100 miles, Mr. Ashcroft, to ask your own daughter to leave the husband she chose, so that you might collect an inheritance her aunt left her in good faith, on the strength of a lawyer's technicality about what counts as settled prospects. I would put it rather more delicately, Mr. Bramwell. I expect you would. I find I have no particular interest in delicacy this afternoon." Elias's jaw had tightened, the first real anger Delphine had seen in him since her arrival. "You sent your daughter west with the words, 'Don't bother coming back.' And you are standing in the yard of the home she built out of that cruelty, asking her to abandon it because a dead woman's money has made her briefly valuable to you again. I find that a considerably uglier proposition than anything I have encountered in 9 years on this claim, and I have wintered alongside grizzly bears with more evident goodwill than what you've just proposed." Delphine found her own voice then, steady despite the trembling she could feel starting somewhere beneath her ribs. "I am not dissolving my marriage, father, and I am not entertaining your solicitor's technicality for one moment longer than it takes me to refuse it plainly. I would ask you to consider, before you argue further, precisely what it says about this family, that the only time you have troubled to cross a continent for me is when there was money attached to the doing of it. Delphine, be reasonable. $11,000 is not a sum to be dismissed lightly." "No, it is not. And I find I am dismissing considerably more than $11,000 by refusing you, father, because I understand precisely what accepting would cost me, and it is worth more than any sum you could name." She lifted her chin, the same practiced angle she'd held at the crossroads 3 weeks before her wedding. Except now, it did not feel practiced at all. "I will write to Aunt Cornelia's solicitor myself, and I will inform him that my marriage to Elias Bramwell stands, and that if the trust's conditions genuinely require dissolving it, then the family may consider the inheritance forfeit, because I will not trade this home for any sum of money, least of all one that requires me to prove myself all over again to people who have never once, in 26 years, thought me worth the proving." Franklin Ashcroft left within the hour, considerably less gracious in departure than he had been in arrival, and the matter might have ended there had the solicitor's actual response, arriving by post 6 weeks later, not proven Delphine's refusal entirely unnecessary in the first place. The will's language, properly examined by a Boise attorney. Elias insisted on consulting rather than trust her father's account of it. Required only that Delphine be lawfully and willingly married, with no further qualification about the geography or grandeur of the union whatsoever. A fact Franklin Ashcroft's own solicitor had apparently either misrepresented or misunderstood, though which of the two Delphine never troubled to determine, having lost what patience she had left for untangling her father's motives. "You mistook the will's terms," Delphine wrote to her father, once the Boise attorney's letter confirmed it. "Or you chose to mistake them, and I confess I have stopped troubling to guess which, because either answer tells me the same thing about how little you trouble to get the truth right where I am concerned." He did not reply to that letter, and did not write again for the better part of a year, and Delphine found, somewhat to her own surprise, that his silence cost her considerably less than she had once believed it would. The inheritance came to her outright, in her own name, that autumn. She used it, over her father's considerable and increasingly distant objections, to buy out the note on a neighboring section that had come up for sale when an ailing rancher decided to sell rather than face another hard winter, doubling the Bramwell claim's grazing land and securing, for the first time in Elias's 9 years on that mountain, a margin against a bad season wide enough that one poor year would not undo a decade's careful work. "You could have kept it for yourself," Elias told her, the evening the papers were signed. "Sent your father packing and quietly banked the whole of it. Nobody in this valley would have thought less of you for it, given what he tried. I did not marry you for $11,000, Elias, and I am not going to let $11,000 become the reason people whisper about why I stayed." Delphine set the deed on the table between them. "I would rather spend it building something neither of us can be talked out of by any relation, present or future, than keep it separate and let it sit there as proof my father was ever right about anything." The valley talked about the visit for months afterward, the way small places always talk, and the talk ran uniformly in Delphine's favor. Hetty Marsh saw to that, telling the story at her own counter to anyone who'd listen, until Franklin Ashcroft's name had become, in that corner of the territory, a byword for a particular kind of fair-weather fatherhood that no one in Cutbank Creek had much patience for. "You didn't have to make a public matter of it," Delphine told Hetty that summer, not entirely displeased despite the words. "Didn't I? I've watched 3 winters go by since you came off that coach half frozen and expecting to be sent packing, and I've watched you turn into the best neighbor this valley's got." Hetty refilled her cup without asking. Man crosses a continent to try and buy back a daughter he threw away for free. Seemed to me the valley ought to know exactly what kind of arithmetic that was, so nobody around here ever mistook cruelty for something forgivable just because it showed up wearing a fine coat. The following spring, Marguerite wrote, the first word from the family since her father's failed visit, a single letter that arrived without warning and without, Delphine noted, any request attached to it at all. "I have thought a great deal about the ribbon," the letter said, in her sister's careful, familiar hand. "I told myself, packing your trunk, that I was doing something almost kind. Tucking in a small vanity for a woman I believed was being sent to a hard, loveless place. I understand now that the unkindness was never in the giving of the ribbon. It was in everything that came before it. Years of believing you needed dressing up to be worth anything to anybody, when the truth, from everything Father's furious letters describe, is that you found a man who thought you worth everything exactly as you already were. I am sorry, Delphine. I do not know that sorry is worth much, arriving this late and asking nothing in return, but I find I could not go on letting it sit unsaid." Delphine read the letter twice, and did not answer it for a month. And when she finally did, she enclosed, folded inside her own reply, the blue ribbon itself. "I am keeping the memory of it," she wrote, "but not the object. I find I no longer need reminding what I look like to someone determined not to see me kindly. I have a husband for that instead, and he does the job considerably better than a scrap of ribbon ever could. 10 years on, the Bramwell claim ran cattle across nearly 1,000 acres. And the small cabin Delphine had first walked into as a stranger had grown 2 rooms and a proper porch, and the mirror by the washstand, replaced twice over the years, each time a little finer, had never once been without a length of blue ribbon tucked into its frame, though it was, by then, a different ribbon than the original, that one having finally, gently, worn past keeping. "Your father writes again," Elias said, one evening, finding his wife at the kitchen table with the day's post. "Wanting to know if we'd consider hosting him and your mother for a proper visit come summer." No mention of solicitors this time. Delphine considered the letter a long moment. "Write back and tell him yes," she said finally. "Not because I've forgotten what he said in that dooryard, and not because I need his good opinion to know what I'm worth, but because I've built a life out here solid enough now that I find I'm not frightened of him seeing it. And I think there's a particular satisfaction in a father finally witnessing, with his own eyes, exactly how wrong he was." Their daughter, Rose, who was 7 that summer and had inherited her mother's steady chin and her father's quiet way of watching a room before speaking in it, wanted to know why her grandfather had never once come to visit before. And Delphine found herself answering, choosing her words with more care than the question strictly required. "Your grandfather did not think much of me for a long while, Rose. He has come round to it slowly, and I find I would rather let him keep coming round in his own time than hold the old unkindness over him forever. People can change if you let them, though you're not obliged to make it easy. Would you let me marry somebody far away? If I wanted, I would let you marry whoever you chose, wherever you chose to find him," Delphine said, "provided he looked at you the way your father looked at me the first morning I stood in Hetty Marsh's yard smelling of 3 weeks on a coach. That is the only test that has ever mattered to me, and I mean to hold you to it same as I held myself. That is a considerably more generous reason than I'd have managed, in your position." "I am not being generous, Elias," Delphine smiled, the easy, unguarded smile that had taken her husband the better part of a year to properly earn. "I am being triumphant. There's a difference, and I've found I rather enjoy it. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where a family's cruelty became, against every intention behind it, the making of somebody's whole life, then this story was for you." Out on the high ground above Cutbank Creek, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Elias Bramwell and Delphine Ashcroft became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real, though the ribbon in that mirror frame remembers it still, and nobody in that house has ever needed reminding twice. If stories of frontier love that turned a joke into a home, and a stranger's kindness into a whole life's proof, speak to you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.